The wind stirred the edge of the prairie as dawn crept over the horizon in shades of ash and rust. Most mornings on the Callahan Ranch started with the sound of boots hitting packed dirt and coffee boiling over a camp stove. But before any of that, Clara Boone was already gone. No good mornings, no explanation, no glance back. Just the creak of the back gate, the quiet swish of her canvas satchel slung over one shoulder, and the worn handle of her axe glinting in the weak morning light. She moved like someone born to the silence, slipping past the horse pens and through the fence line while the rest of the world was still trying to shake off sleep. The ranch hands watched her go with half-curious eyes, muttering jokes they didn't quite believe. Maybe she's carving her own coffin out there, one would say, chuckling as he tugged on his boots. Maybe she's got a man in the woods, another replied, grinning behind a chipped enamel mug. No one ever followed her. No one really cared to. Clara worked hard, didn't speak unless she had to, and never gave them a reason to look closer. That was just how things were. She came with no references, just a letter in the boss's hand, and calluses that proved she knew how to handle a horse, and a fence post. Grady Callahan had hired her on instinct, or maybe guilt, and left her alone out of habit. But on the 7th morning of that cold March week, something shifted. Breakfast came and went, the sun climbed higher, chores were finished, the cook rang the bell for the midday meal. Still no Clara. It was Slim who first spoke up, half laughing. Hell, maybe she finally ran off with that ghost husband she don't talk about. A few chuckles followed, but they were uneasy this time. Slim glanced toward the tree line she always disappeared into, brow furrowed. She usually back by now, ain't she? Grady Callahan didn't answer. He stood by the corral, staring past the fence, one hand resting on a saddle horn. The sky above the ridge hung gray and heavy. He'd noticed Clara's patterns long before the others did. He knew the exact hour she slipped away each morning, and how she always came back by noon, hair damp with sweat and a bundle of firewood strapped to her back. Always enough for the bunkhouse, always perfectly stacked. He never asked why. But now it was past 1, and she was still gone. Grady muttered something under his breath and tossed his gloves into the saddlebag. The hands watched him swing up into the saddle, his jaw set, and his eyes narrowed. "Boss?" Slim asked, hesitating. "You think something's wrong?" Grady didn't answer. He just nudged his horse toward the ridge, heading for the trees Clara disappeared into every morning. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe just Clara with a twisted ankle or lost in her thoughts. But deep in his gut, a quiet voice whispered what he hadn't dared admit to himself until now. No one collects firewood like that every day, unless they're hiding something. Grady Callahan had seen his fair share of people come and go. The ones who stayed too long usually wanted something, and the ones who kept their heads down were often running from something worse. He never pried. Wasn't his nature. The world had taught him that asking questions got you tangled in answers that didn't change anything. So when Clara Boone showed up with her sharp eyes and silence like armor, he hired her without a word of welcome and didn't expect one in return. But some things have a way of getting under a man's skin, no matter how thick it's gotten. For weeks, he watched her slip into the forest with that same worn satchel and the axe that looked heavier than she let on. Always before the sun rose proper, always gone before the rest of the ranch even stirred. Grady figured she was just a solitary sort, maybe still grieving something or someone. The West was full of women like that. Hard women, quiet women, survivors. But when she didn't return the day before, something shifted in him. Not panic, just a kind of weight in his chest that wouldn't lift. So the next morning, he saddled his horse in the dark, skipped coffee, and waited up by the East Ridge. From that height, you could see the forest bend and breathe like a sleeping thing. Pines stretched for miles, cloaking secrets in shadow, their branches creaking in rhythm with the wind. He spotted her just past first light, a moving speck of black against the silver of morning frost. She didn't know she was being watched. Grady stayed far back, weaving through the trees, careful with every hoof step, every breath. The woods swallowed sound, and he let them. Clara moved with practiced purpose, not like someone gathering firewood, not like someone out for a stroll. She glanced over her shoulder twice, slowed near a bend in the trail, then veered off the path altogether. That's when Grady dismounted and followed on foot, boots muffled by damp pine needles. The trail she took led to a narrow clearing nearly hidden by underbrush and a ring of cedar. The air felt different there, stiller, heavy with the kind of silence that makes your skin tighten. And then he saw it. A crude shelter, nothing more than tarps, pine boughs, and old canvas nailed between trees barely visible through the thicket. And beneath it, a flicker of movement. Small hands. A head of tangled hair, another one, then a third, 3 children. They didn't make a sound, but they were there thin, wide-eyed, wrapped in hand-me-down rags, and huddled like animals that had learned too young not to trust anything taller than them. Grady's jaw locked, his fists clenched at his sides. Clara stepped into the clearing and knelt beside one of them, brushing dirt from the boy's cheek with a tenderness that twisted something deep in Grady's gut. She pulled bread from her satchel, a flask of water, a blanket. The children devoured the bread with quiet desperation, never taking their eyes off her. They looked at her like she was the only thing keeping the wolves at bay. And Grady understood something then. Clara Boone wasn't gathering firewood. She was building a wall between those kids and a world that had already tried to break them. The axe hit the stump with a dull crack, sending a splintered log tumbling to the side. Clara Boone didn't pause. She reached for another, set it steady, and swung again. The rhythm was relentless: chop, breathe, gather, repeat, like a ritual meant to keep the weight in her chest from suffocating her completely. She wasn't just splitting firewood. She was staving off the dark, and every swing of that axe was a promise. Behind her, nestled in the shadows of cedar and bramble, the children sat huddled in the lean-to, their eyes wide and haunted. The shelter wasn't much a sagging structure of tarps and scavenged wood, barely holding back the wind, but it was the only thing standing between them and the raw indifference of the wilderness. They didn't speak, didn't cry. They just watched her, like she was the only thing tethering them to the earth. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10. A girl, wiry and sharp-eyed, her face smudged with dirt and resolve. She kept the younger two pressed close: a boy, with hair like straw and a limp in his left leg, and a girl so small she still sucked the frayed edge of her coat sleeve. They were skin and bones beneath their patchwork layers, shadows of children who'd already seen too much. But they were alive, and as long as Clara had strength in her arms, they would stay that way. Grady Callahan stood behind a tree just beyond the clearing's edge, eyes narrowed, heart thudding hard against his ribs. He hadn't meant to spy, but now that he had, he couldn't look away. He watched as Clara finished her chopping and laid the axe aside with care, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve. She moved to the shelter and crouched low, her movements gentle, measured. From her satchel, she pulled out a tin of beans, opened it with a worn pocket knife, and handed it to the oldest girl without a word. The girl took it slowly, nodding once before passing it to the others. Clara didn't smile, didn't speak, just watched them eat like she was counting each bite. When the littlest one coughed, she reached out to rub her back in slow circles. That tenderness, so at odds with her hard silence on the ranch, hit Grady like a kick to the gut. He'd thought she was just strange, damaged, maybe. The kind of woman who worked hard and kept to herself because life had turned her cold. But this wasn't cold. This was the kind of warmth you had to fight the world for. He took a slow step back, careful not to snap a twig. Clara didn't know he was there, and maybe for now, it was better that way. But the tightness in his chest told him he couldn't leave this alone. Not anymore. Whatever she was running from, whatever these children were hiding from, it wasn't just firewood she was collecting. It was safety. It was shelter. It was survival. And Grady Callahan wasn't sure if the woman he thought he'd hired was a liar, a fugitive, or a saint, but he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just chopping wood. She was preparing for war. The snap of a twig gave him away. Clara's head turned slowly toward the sound, her hand instinctively reaching for the axe she'd leaned against the stump. Her eyes found him through the trees, calm but sharp, as if she'd known all along he'd been watching. Grady Callahan stepped into the clearing, hands raised slightly, not in surrender, just enough to show he meant no harm. The axe stayed where it was, but Clara didn't relax, not 1 inch. "You lost?" she asked, her voice like dry leaves on gravel. "No," he said quietly. "I was looking for you." She didn't answer right away, just stood there, pale hair stuck to her brow with sweat, shirt damp and arms trembling slightly from the morning's work. Behind her, the children had gone still, 3 small shadows pressed against the canvas wall, staring at the stranger who had entered their fragile world. "I'll leave if I have to," she said flatly. Grady's brow furrowed. "I didn't say that. You don't have to. I know how this looks." He took a slow step forward, careful not to startle the kids or her. "It looks like something I should have asked about a long time ago." She studied him then, not with fear, but with the kind of guarded exhaustion that comes from carrying too many secrets for too long. "They ain't mine," she said softly. "But I'd die for them just the same." Grady's jaw tightened. "Then whose are they?" Clara looked away. The wind rustled the trees overhead, carrying the faint scent of pine and ash. She crouched down, pulled the littlest girl onto her lap, and wrapped an arm around her small shoulders. The other 2 pressed closer. "My sisters," Clara said finally. "Or they were. She's gone now. Left them with a man who calls himself a preacher, but he ain't no man of God." She didn't look at Grady when she said it, just stared at the horizon like she could see ghosts walking there. "I went back for them. Took them in the night, and ran. Had to. I heard what he did to her. I saw what he did to the boy." Her voice cracked on that word, and the boy flinched slightly, as if remembering. "They're scared of everything. Won't eat unless I taste it first. Flinch at doors creaking. Cry when it rains too hard." Grady's stomach turned. The oldest girl looked up at him with eyes far too old for her face, and he knew deep in his gut that Clara wasn't lying. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice hoarse now. "Didn't plan on staying, just needed work. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere they wouldn't find us." "And if I hadn't followed you?" Grady asked. She shrugged, lips tightening. "Then, I'd have kept hiding them until I couldn't anymore." He stood in silence for a long moment, hands in fists, trying to remember when he'd last seen something so damn raw. Finally, he said, "You're not leaving. Not unless you want to. You're not the one I'm worried about." Her eyes flicked back to his, and for the first time, the fire in them softened. "Not much, but enough." "I can't keep them safe forever," she whispered. Grady stepped closer. "Then let me help." The town of Alder Ridge sat quiet under a thin veil of morning fog, the kind that clung to windows and softened the edges of the buildings, like a warning not yet spoken. Marshal Dean Vickers stepped out of the sheriff's office with a fresh stack of posters in one hand and a tack hammer in the other. He didn't rush. Men like him never did, not when the law was on their side. Not when the faces they pinned on boards were already guilty in the eyes of the right people. He crossed the dirt road to the general store, slapped the first poster onto the cracked notice board beside ads for seed grain, fencing repair, and a lost collie named Duke. The hammer struck wood with a dull rhythm, 1, 2, 3, and then he stood back, eyeing the paper like it might speak. The face staring back wasn't blurry, wasn't even angry, just tired, haunted. Clara Boone. Wanted. Unlawful abduction of minors. Fugitive approach with caution. Last seen heading northwest on horseback. In possession of 3 children, believed to be taken from guardians' legal custody. A man stepped up beside him, tall and narrow with preacher's clothes so stiff they barely moved with his body. His hat was pristine, boots polished, fingers heavy with gold, but it was the ring on his left hand that caught the sun like a blade. "I appreciate your help, Marshal," the man said with a voice sweet enough to sour milk. "They're my family. She's confused is all. Lost her way after my wife passed." Vickers didn't answer at first, just watched as the preacher adjusted his cuffs and smiled too widely at a passing woman who looked away, quick and sharp. "Just so I have it straight," Vickers finally said. "She took your wife's children in the middle of the night, ran without a word, and hasn't contacted anyone since. And your only goal is to bring them home?" The preacher nodded solemnly. "I forgive her, truly. She's grieving, we all are. But those kids, they need structure. They need faith. She's a danger to herself, Marshal, and to them." "Funny," Vickers said, pulling another poster from the stack. "A woman that dangerous didn't even raise her voice when she applied for a job at the Callahan spread. Did a damn fine job fencing and hauling feed, too, from what I hear." The preacher's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "Then maybe you ought to ask yourself what a woman like that is trying so hard to hide." The marshal didn't respond, but the seed had been planted, and they both knew it. By noon, the posters were up across town. Saloon door, feed store, church steps. Grady's ranch hand Slim saw one on a whiskey run and stared at it long enough to forget why he'd come. Back on the Callahan ranch, the wind picked up, dry and sour, the kind that carried news before mouths ever opened. Clara Boone was no longer just a quiet woman with a heavy past. She was a wanted fugitive. And the man hunting her wore both a wedding ring and a wolf's smile. The fire crackled low in the pit, its orange glow flickering against the canvas walls of the makeshift shelter like ghost shadows come to listen. Clara sat cross-legged on the cold earth, her back straight, shoulders drawn tight as wire. The axe lay beside her, not for protection now, but habit. The children were asleep finally. Bellies warm from stew Grady had helped her make, their small bodies curled like pups in worn blankets. It was the quietest the woods had been all day, the safest. Grady didn't speak. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, hands resting on his knees, hat in his lap. His presence said everything his mouth didn't. That he wasn't there to judge, that he'd listen if she wanted to talk, that he'd stay even if she didn't. Clara stared into the flames, face bathed in gold, eyes hollow and far away. "I told the sheriff once," she said finally. Her voice came like wind through dead grass. "Told him what I saw, what that man did." Grady didn't look at her, but his jaw clenched. "My sister, Ruthiesh, married young. Too young. Thought a preacher meant safety, meant kindness. But that man, he preached with one hand on the Bible, and the other curled into a fist." Her lips trembled, but she didn't stop. "At first, she hid it. Said it was her fault. Said he just got angry sometimes. Said it was between husband and wife, and I should keep out of it." She swallowed hard. The wind outside whispered through the pines like it wanted her to hush. But she kept going. "One day, I came early. Brought food. Walked in on Himbelt in one hand, the boy in the other. 10 years old. Crying so hard he couldn't breathe." Grady's fingers dug into the rim of his hat. "I grabbed that boy and ran. Tried to take the girls too, but Ruthiesh screamed at me to leave. Said I'd make it worse. Said I was trying to ruin her family." Clara's voice cracked, and she dropped her gaze into the fire, like she could disappear inside it. "I went to the law, went to the church elders, told them everything, but he'd already told his version, said I was jealous, bitter, that I wanted her life, that I'd made it all up." Her mouth twisted into something between a laugh and a sob. "No one believed me then, so I stopped talking." The flames popped and hissed. One of the children shifted in their sleep, a tiny hand reaching out, brushing the air like they were dreaming of someone they'd lost. "I waited too long. Ruthie died a year later. Sick, they said, but I saw the bruises at the funeral." Grady finally turned to look at her. His eyes were steady, dark, and full of quiet storm. I went back for the kids, took 'em in the night, no plan, just couldn't leave them with him, couldn't bury them too. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. I know what it looks like, a woman alone with 3 kids that ain't hers, hiding out in the woods. But I swear to God, I'd rather die than send them back. Grady didn't say a word. He just reached out, slowly, and tossed another log on the fire. And then he stayed. All night. Grady rode into Alder Ridge just after sunrise, his hat low, his coat dusty from the miles behind him. The town was barely stirring shop, doors creaked open, smoke drifted from chimneys, and horses clopped lazily along the frozen main street. He tied his mare behind the supply store and stepped inside without a word. Mrs. Ellison looked up from her ledger, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're out early." "Need boots," Grady said simply. 3 pairs, small sizes. She didn't ask who for. She didn't have to. Word had traveled fast since the marshal pinned up those posters. Clara Boone's name was now spoken behind raised brows and whispered over pews. Half the town claimed they knew all along, and the other half just wanted her gone. But Grady didn't flinch at their stares. He paid in silver, packed the boots into his saddlebag, and moved on. Next stop was the livery. Then the post office. Then one quiet knock at the back door of an old stone building that had once served as a printing press. Inside, he met with a man whose name stayed out of trouble, but whose hands had ink stains the law never quite washed away. They spoke only once, voices low, steady. When Grady emerged, he carried more than supplies. He carried the truth. By the time he returned to the ranch, dusk was bleeding into the hills. The children spotted him first, running out from behind the lean-to, their bare feet kicking up dust. Clara stood nearby, a bucket in one hand, her face unreadable. Grady swung down from the saddle and pulled the new boots free. 3 pairs, brown leather, good soles, warm linings. Not fancy, just decent. The kids lit up like they'd been given gold. He handed Clara a wrapped bundle of dried meat and oats, followed by a small canvas roll of thread and needles. "Figured you could use more." She nodded, her lips tight. "Thank you." But he wasn't done. "I heard something," he said quietly. "In town." Her hands froze around the bundle. "The marshal's riding out. Not tomorrow, tonight. Said he got word from a judge in Junction City. No more waiting on witnesses. No more asking questions." He met her eyes, the weight of what came next pressing between them like thunder. "He's bringing chains." The wind stilled. The pines, once whispering, went silent. Clara didn't speak right away. She turned to glance at the children laughing over their boots, trying them on with wide grins and awkward balance. 3 lives she'd carved from silence and fear. 3 lives she'd risked everything to protect. Grady placed a worn rifle on the stump beside her. "You'll have to decide soon," he said softly. "Fight or run." She looked at the rifle, then back to him. "And you?" Grady stared out toward the ridge, where the trees swallowed light, like secrets. "I'm not letting them take you without a damn reason." And for the first time in weeks, Clara let herself believe she might not have to do this alone. The first light of morning spilled through the pines like a warning, cold and gold and deadly quiet. Dew clung to every blade of grass, every twisted root along the edge of Clara's clearing, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. They heard the horses before they saw them, hooves muffled on pine needles, slow and deliberate. Grady stood at the edge of the tree line, rifle in hand, eyes fixed ahead. Clara was beside him, her palms slick against the worn grip of her father's old revolver. Her hands didn't shake, not anymore. She wasn't running this time. Behind them, the children huddled low in the shelter, barely breathing. The oldest girl clutched the littlest tight, shielding her body like a wall of skin and bone. The boy with the limp gripped a stick, not because it would help, but because holding something felt braver than holding nothing. The marshal rode in like he owned the air around him. Dean Vickers, tall in the saddle, badge gleaming on his chest like polished threat. Two deputies followed, guns visible, hands resting casual on their belts. The preacher wasn't far behind, sitting high on a gray gelding, smile thin and venomous, a Bible in one hand and the devil in his eyes. "Well now," the marshal called out, reining in just short of the fire pit. "Didn't expect such a warm welcome." "You're not welcome," Grady said flatly. Clara didn't speak. She kept her gaze on the preacher, who was scanning the clearing with the hunger of a man who saw nothing but property, even in people. "I got papers," Vickers said, waving a folded document. "Signed by a territorial judge. Says those children belong to their guardian. This man right here." Grady took a step forward. "They're not livestock. They're not yours either, Callahan." "No," Grady agreed, "but they sure as hell don't belong to a man who beats them into silence and calls it salvation." The marshal's smile cracked. "Careful who you accuse." "I'm not accusing," Clara said then, her voice hard and even. "I'm stating what I saw, what I lived." She stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Her revolver stayed down, but her stare never wavered. "These kids were starved, bruised, terrified. You want to act like that's legal, Marshal, fine, but don't pretend it's right." Vickers shifted in his saddle. One of the deputies looked uneasy now, eyes darting between the preacher and Clara. "We've got witnesses," Grady added, voice low. "We've got statements. You think you're the only one who talks to the circuit judge?" Behind them, the wind picked up. From the ridge came the sound of more hooves. Riders, townsfolk, a dozen strong. Men and women from Alder Ridge, their faces grim and quiet, forming a line behind Clara's clearing. The marshal's horse stamped nervously. "What the hell is this?" Vickers barked. "Reckoning," Grady said. The preacher's face went pale. For the first time, he realized he wasn't surrounded by criminals. He was surrounded by witnesses. And the badge on Vickers' chest wasn't enough to save either of them now. The air between them tightened, as if the trees themselves had gone still to listen. The children behind Clara clung to each other in silence, their wide eyes fixed on the men with guns and power and cold smiles. But Clara stood tall, her boots planted in the dirt, her fingers wrapped around the grip of her revolver, not pointing it, just holding it like a promise. Marshal Vickers shifted in his saddle, eyes flicking to the townsfolk gathering behind the clearing. Too many for comfort, not enough for control. The preacher's face had lost its oily calm, his knuckles bone-white around the leather reins. Grady Callahan stepped forward slowly, rifle lowered but still in hand. His expression didn't shift, didn't soften. He moved like someone who had already made peace with what came next. When he reached the marshal, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a weathered envelope, and held it out between two fingers. "Before this goes any further," he said, "you'll want to read this." Vickers frowned, but took the letter, broke the seal. The paper crackled in the stillness as he unfolded it, eyes scanning the page. It didn't take long, less than a minute, maybe, but by the time he reached the bottom, the confidence had drained from his face. It was signed by Governor Wallace himself. A directive authorizing a formal investigation into reported child abuse across multiple counties. It named the preacher. It named Tobias Crow. It listed 2 children previously found dead under unspecified guardianship. It was a political bombshell wrapped in a quiet sheet of parchment, and it bore the governor's seal, unmistakable in its wax-red finality. Vickers swallowed hard. "Where'd you get this?" Grady didn't blink. "I called in a favor." That was when Clara's head snapped toward him. She looked stunned, like the dirt under her boots had shifted. "You, how?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Grady didn't look at her. He reached back into his saddlebag and produced a second item, a thick, leather-bound ledger. He handed it to the marshal without a word. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, names, dates, descriptions, witness accounts, former ranch hands, townsfolk. Even a doctor who had quietly treated Clara's niece for a broken arm and hadn't dared report it. Some were anonymous, some were signed, all of it documented, all of it true. Clara stepped back, hands trembling now. She hadn't known. Hadn't known Grady had seen everything: the bruises, the flinches, the silent way the children curled into themselves when footsteps approached. She hadn't known he'd believed her before she ever spoke the full story. Vickers closed the ledger with a slow exhale, then turned toward the preacher. "This true?" he asked, almost a whisper. The preacher didn't answer. He just sat there, frozen, sweating in the morning chill. One of the deputies shifted uneasily, then dismounted altogether. Grady finally turned to Clara, his voice low, meant only for her. "I don't know how to fix what's already broken," he said, "but I can help stop it from breaking more." And for the first time, Clara let her gun fall to her side. Because someone finally believed her. And someone with power had finally done something about it. The axe split the log with a clean crack, and the sound rang out through the trees like a song. Morning sun filtered down through the pines, turning everything gold and soft and new. Clara Boone stood in the clearing, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sweat already forming at her brow. Her movements were steady, practiced muscle memory by now. She lifted another log, set it firm on the stump, and swung again. But this time, she wasn't alone. A small pair of boots scrambled past her, nearly tripping over a root, followed by another set, and then a third. The children darted through the clearing with sticks in their hands and wild stories on their tongues. The littlest girl wore boots 2 sizes too big, but she didn't care. She giggled as she tried to keep up with her brother, who'd declared himself captain of the forest patrol. Clara paused, watching them, just for a moment. The sound of their laughter filled the trees, bounced off bark, and settled into the soil like something that had been missing for too long. "Don't go past the ridge," she called, half laughing herself, "and stay where I can see you." "Yes, ma'am," came 3 eager replies. She turned back to her task, chopping another log clean through, but her hands didn't shake anymore. Her jaw wasn't clenched. She didn't look over her shoulder like something might come crashing out of the woods. Everything was different now. The preacher had been escorted out of Alder Ridge in shackles, his smile long gone, his sermons silenced. Tobias Crow vanished before the second warrant reached the town. And Marshal Vickers? He kept his badge, but walked a little quieter, now like he knew the town was watching him too. Grady sat on the porch of the main house, coffee in hand, boots propped on the railing. He watched her from a distance, the sun catching the edge of his grin. It was small but real. Something that hadn't touched his face in years. Not since the war. Not since the letters stopped coming. He still rose early, still checked the fences and walked the property line. But now, when he returned, there were voices in the air. The smell of porridge from the old potbelly stove. The sound of Clara telling a boy to mind his chores. A girl asking if her stitches were straight enough. Laughter at the dinner table. Light in windows that had stayed dark far too long. She still chopped firewood. That hadn't changed. But now she did it with sleeves rolled up and dirt on her cheek and a trail of little footprints behind her. No longer hiding, no longer alone. Grady sipped his coffee and watched as one of the children ran back to Clara and threw arms around her waist without a word. She knelt down, hugged them close, and whispered something that made the child beam. What Grady had found in that woman wasn't just a runaway with secrets. He'd found purpose again. And a reason to stay.